right. Well, we'd like to thank everyone this morning for joining us. This is our first LaPorte Cafe of 2022, and we're back and ready to discuss some trending topics that we see affecting the public sector, and just to help you and your organization create some internal and external conversations and hopefully lead to improvements and strengthening of your organization. Just a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees are muted. The video is off and the chat function is disabled. If you do have a question, you can submit that through the Q&A portal located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And our presentation is conversational, no prepared slides. This morning, my name is Lester Richoux. I'm a director here at LaPorte in the Audit and Assurance Services, and with me is Anthony Rutledge. He's a senior manager also in Audit and Assurance Services, and between the two of us, we cover quite a bit of single audits. So today's topic, we want to cover some federal awards and best practices and what to do when you get that notification that you've just received some federal money. So, the first impulse is to just spend it, but obviously you want to set up some things first beforehand. And we would suggest one of the most important things is to designate a grant admin. And that seems obvious, but some folks, the award went out, maybe somebody at the organizational level in charge signed the agreement, and you as the director of finance or somewhere in the accounting department get this grant, and now all of a sudden you're going to get some money, and no one really knows who's in charge of the grant. We're thinking some large organizations obviously have a robust accounting department and grant admins, but some smaller organizations may just be a couple of folks, one or two or three. Who's going to be in charge of this, and why is that important to have a grant admin designated? Well, who's going to collect all the information? Who's going to compile, your guidance? Who's going to compile? Who's responsible for accumulating those records? So it's important to designate someone as the grant admin, and that person is going to be the focal point for the further things we're going to discuss. So, Anthony, what's next? Once you have a grant admin set up, and you've got someone who's identified, what's the next thing that's very important that organizations should accomplish?
No, just to kind of echo building the team, right? Just kind of echo having that person there that's going to take responsibility for everything. Outside of that, right, the next best thing is to, of course, make sure you have a plan in place for documenting everything. For documenting everything surrounding your requirements around the grant award. And it's different for every organization, right? And it's different for every grant. Some organizations, you might have a programmatic person or an operations person that's been leading the charge on obtaining this grant, and finance doesn't really know about it until after the fact, and they're kind of charged with keeping track of everything. But you really want to have synchronicity between the two, and documentation efforts might differ on both sides. So it's really important to have a conversation amongst the team, to have a meeting amongst the team once the grant award is provided to the organization, to say, this is what programmatic personnel are charged with keeping, this is what they're charged with doing, these are the controls they're charged with meeting, and this is how the finance department uses it. It sounds perfect when you describe it out like that, right? But as Lester kind of alluded to, not every department is built with 20 people. Sometimes it's one or two people. So you kind of want to make sure you have the right person reviewing, documenting the right thing, keeping the right record, and kind of getting all of that structured. And if you're not entirely sure exactly where to get that information from, always go back to the grant award. Always look up the assistance listing number. ALN is now the new acronym for what was formerly CFDA number. But if you go back to the roots of where the grant came from and the department at the federal level that define what the requirements are, you should be able to determine exactly what's needed in terms of documentation compliance. So, and then of course, policies and procedures. If you want to talk a little about that, Lester, there's a lot to document there in terms of making sure that you're not only keeping the records, but following your own protocols over how you want to keep the records.
Right. And just something you mentioned earlier, just the grant award. I know from experience, oftentimes it's a little bit difficult to actually get your hands on some of those grant documents, but it is important to have those, retain those on file at your organization. And one of the other important things you mentioned, the budget. If you had to prepare a budget for that particular grant, keep that handy. Obviously, you want to monitor your budget. You want to make sure you're spending the money appropriately, but there may be some elements that you have to do a budget to actual. So another element that person, that grant admin, is going to have to look at is the budget. But policies and procedures, something that might need to be crafted for this particular grant. Maybe you don't have a history of spending federal money, and so you might not have particular written policies and procedures over how to treat this money. It might be different from your normal transaction cycle narratives that you might have at your organization. So you need to develop some policies and procedures. The checks and balances need to be put in place to ensure, because not only are you looking at the internal controls, there's an element of compliance here. You need to make sure you have written policies and procedures in place that are going to help you ensure that you're complying with the requirements of that grant. And there are some specific policies and procedures that need to be written down. If you think, for instance, procurement, sometimes, here in Louisiana, obviously, we have a very robust procurement policy, the public bid law, right? So we're all familiar with that with regards to quotes and bids and things like that. You have that in place, but your federal grant might have additional requirements for procurement. You might need a conflict of interest policy, a records retention policy. So there are specific elements that you will need to make sure are written down in right, and keep those handy, and make sure the folks that are in charge of this grant or maybe spending the money are aware of these policies and procedures. Have a conversation with them about this to ensure compliance. Again, I keep mentioning compliance, and that's the big ticket item here, because at some point, this might all lead to a single audit. If you cross that threshold, we'll throw that number out, $750,000. If you cross that threshold, there's going to be additional things that are done. In some organizations, there's been a lot of federal money in place in the last year or two. We've seen organizations that are for the first time getting these federal funds and undergoing these single audits, and they're struggling, because these are things that they didn't get in place to start with, and they're sort of having to, deal with the repercussions of compliance and those kind of elements now. But it's important to get those documented, get your policies and procedures in place, and communicate those to persons in your organization. And all of that leads to, once you have that written down, is your internal controls. And Anthony's going to talk a little bit about, some of the finer points of getting that in place and communicated.
You bring up a perfect point when it comes to the compliance side. The organizations that haven't yet been through a single audit, or maybe you just started going through them up until this point, a lot of organizations don't necessarily know their requirements for internal controls. They just know, I have a grant, I do what I need to make sure that I document getting paid under that grant, particularly if it passes through direct, maybe a little different. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But until you have to go through the single audit process, you may not have a true appreciation for the internal controls over compliance. And those are really the two arms, just like Lester said, that you would be tested on in that circumstance: compliance and internal controls over compliance. Fortunately, the OMB had the Office of Management and Budget has issued, I think it's up to about 1,700 pages now, a 1,700 page compliance manual that basically gives you everything you need to know about any particular grant and how to make sure you are in compliance with the particular attributes that are applicable to your grant. There's a section in that compliance supplement. If you just Google OMB compliance supplement, section 6 basically gives you internal controls. If you're struggling to think of some, if you're struggling to come up with some that are specific to your organization, go to section 6 in that compliance supplement, and they have example controls for each one of the compliance requirements that might be applicable to your grant. They may not be worded perfectly for your organization, but it gives you a guideline to kind of start with and a place to start with. Those controls are rooted in the COSO framework, right? The federal model for all things internal controls, the generally accepted model, the same thing that public companies use, private companies, governmental companies use to make sure that their internal controls are designed in a way that will be effective, right? But I'm going to echo or parrot something we kind of said earlier. That doesn't mean it's a one size fits all. That doesn't mean that an organization with $2 billion worth of assets is going to have the same controls as $2 million worth of assets. You've got to design it in a way that works for you. And if you don't have enough personnel, definitely go back to your governing board and figure out where they could be involved. All too often, especially with small to medium-sized governmental organizations, the governing board still holds a control or may hold a control in the finance process, particularly with overarching review, or maybe in a very, very small organization, actually reviewing grant awards as they're being approved or as documentation is being approved. But the key there is creating something that's effective for your organization, that's right sized for your organization, and that's cost effective, right? That makes sense, that doesn't become something where you're spending more money than you're earning from the grant award, because then it becomes moot, right? But I think if you can establish those controls, establish who's doing the review, which parties are charged with documenting, how the workflow of the documentation goes from programmatic personnel, grant review personnel, finance personnel, and ultimately up to the organization that's charged with reimbursing you or granting you your funds. I think that is the exact model you want. If you keep it as simple as that and put it all together in a way that works for your organization, you'll be successful in keeping the workflow easy for the pass-through and the grant agencies. Lester, you do a lot of work with organizations that are mostly at pass-throughs or direct awards. What kind of is your practice?
It's a mix of both, and it's important to realize, where your grant was awarded from, because one of the important elements that you want to maintain is that clear line of communication between your awarder and you want to maintain that communication. Oftentimes, you may have to communicate directly with the state, but some federal awards come from, directly from the federal government. You want to maintain an open line of communication with your pass-through entity, because they may release information via email to you that might give you some insight on the grant itself. It might give you a risk alert. Oftentimes, when the federal government deems a particular grant to be risky, they will indicate that via an email blast. So, I talked to someone once and they said, well, I'm not getting anything from the federal government on this. And, it's as simple as it was stuck in the email, your spam filter. So, it seems counterintuitive that you have to go and check all these things to make sure you're getting the right amount of information. But and sometimes we get email overload too, right? There's no longer paper communications. These are all email blasts, or you got to go to the website. Risk alerts come out via the websites for some of these grants and some of these organizations. So it's important to stay in touch with that grantor and see if there's any amendments to the grant or further communications that flow through to give you insight, changes. And Anthony mentioned downloading the compliance supplement as well. They have addendums to that often to release more information. I think you mentioned those are kind of built for auditors, but you can gain some insight onto the overall program, into compliance, into what the expectation is from the federal government for that program through that compliance supplement. What are they asking the auditors to look for? Well, those are things you should be doing, organizations should be doing. So it's important to look at these things and keep track of the risk alerts, keep track of the updates to these contracts and these compliance supplements. And, that's why, it all circles back. A designated individual to accomplish these tasks. We're loading a lot onto some small organizations, finance manager, but there's an additional burden when you get this money. It's not just immediately write the checks and spend the money. There's a lot of extra steps you have to go through, and we certainly understand that. We see folks that are burdened with that, and hopefully, we can alleviate some of that with some things to do. Up next, another thing we're going to add to your plate. What about recording and information, Anthony? What should we be looking for there?
Yeah, no, and real quick before I forget, I want to circle to something you said on the supplement too. If you have challenges with reaching a program officer at the state level, which usually you don't, they're great in Louisiana. Every department there has a very robust team that usually will answer questions. But also, if you have direct awards, don't fear reaching out to the program officer, right? I've experienced a lot of just personally with my clients this year and with folks that I've consulted with, there's a lot of turnover with personnel, right? But there's always someone assigned to the grant at the federal level and at the state level, right? And every organization is experiencing that in terms of the turnover. So you may not have the same program officer you started with, but don't fear reaching out to them because they do want to help. They'd rather know situations you're running into beforehand before it becomes a challenge on the back end with trying to make sure that you get your reimbursement or you get your drawdown approved. There is a list of contacts at the state level and in the compliance supplement in the back as well. There's a designated list that comes out every year. And again, if that's not the right name because something's changed, there's still a phone number to call and they'll get you connected with the right person. They've always been very, very responsive for me whenever we need to help our clients seek guidance. But to your point about reporting and recording, the easiest thing you can do for yourself is to make sure that the records that you're tracking are purposeful, are distinct, and are making it easy on the parties that are reviewing everything for you, right? You usually have reimbursement request reports or drawdown reports that have to identify the purpose of the records. You have to submit backup copies of the records, right? Using payroll as an example, probably the most common thing that anyone on this call and really in the state would be reimbursed for a particular program, particularly with all of the ESSER and CARES Act money that happened this year. A lot of that was payroll reimbursement. Make it easy on yourself by tracking level of effort. Make it easy on yourself by itemizing the employees and the time reported. If you submit a report to the granting agency and it just says, it's a handwritten list of employees and times and days and a number on the side, they're going to keep coming back at you with information that they need to approve that reimbursement. Vouch everything, trace everything into the records that come from the payroll records, that come from the checks. Just make it as easy as possible to support your effort and to support the purpose of the expenses. Outside of that, the reimbursement request process and the drawdown process, if you don't know exactly what needs to be done this day and age with your grant, again, pull back up the grant award, see how it's supposed to be structured. There's usually always a template for a particular grant that says this is how you do the reimbursement process for this grant. Definitely get that all set up. And then lastly, knowing at the end of the grant or at the end of the grant year, sometimes if it's a multiple year award, make sure you give the updated annual reporting that you have to give to your grantors so they know the status of where you are with the monies. We've seen circumstances where the grant is going along well, but the annual report wasn't filed because that communication didn't happen. And next thing you know, the reimbursement requests are being delayed just for this annual update that has to kind of be prepared. Those are the main kind of thoughts I had there. There are some examples we could get into with non-payroll if we had time, but I figured the payroll example would suit best for our audience. What do you think?
Yeah, and certainly, we've seen the last couple of years with the CARES Act money coming out, and sort of some of the guidance has come out after the fact, right? They handed out the money and then they figured out the reporting on the back end. And certainly it's tough. I guess what we suggest is if you have federal money and federal related expenses, to try to segregate them as best as you can in the GL, when you're recording those transactions, to at least try to carve those out and not commingle all the transactions. We've seen some organizations that have a robust accounting department, they're able to have a grants department and they have grant funds as well, and not all, they're segregated, but it's difficult. But for smaller organizations, they do tend to commingle things, but the best you can to separate that information out. It will help on the back end for reporting in order to compile some of this information. And then one of the other elements I think we wanted to mention was, sometimes some grants have specific information that has to be collected as far as metrics. I think sometimes about it like a transportation grant. I know there's some metrics as far as mileage and things like that. It's good ahead of time. We talk about the grant admin figuring out who's going to collect that data, because sometimes it might not even be accounting related. That's a different department altogether. But the reporting might fall on your accounting department. And so determining who's going to collect that information and get it timely submitted. We talk about timelines. Reporting is often a major compliance element for most federal awards. So just from the beginning, determining when your reporting requirements are. Is it quarterly? Is it an annual report on the back end? Is it a final closeout report? Scheduling that, it might be as simple as just putting it in an Outlook calendar so you don't forget, because as simple as that seems, it's easy to forget these reporting requirements. and know the final day to use your funds, know the period of availability for those funding requirements to spend the money. And then subsequently, if there's something that needs to be done, an amendment, we see a lot of times organizations don't get the money spent in the right amount of time, but often the federal government's able to grant amendments. It's back to that communications with your pastor entity to see if you can get an amendment. There's always something that delays, and certainly in the last couple of years between hurricanes and COVID, there have been issues with organizations spending that money. There's been extensions granted, but being aware of the timeline to spend your funds and then to subsequently report that information. So now that you have all that set up, that's quite a bit of things. I would be remiss if we didn't mention, there's a next step that might happen in your organization, and that might be a single audit, right, Anthony? Just a little bit. I know we're running low on time here, but just a little bit about what might happen next once you've done all this. Could there be a single audit, and what that even means?
Yeah. So you talked about the threshold a little bit earlier, $750,000, right? If you receive or expend receive and expend more than $750,000 during a fiscal year, it triggers a single audit, right? So think about if you were a governmental entity, right? You were going through your typical financial governmental audit. I jokingly call it a bonus audit because it really is. It's not part of the financial statement audit. It's got a completely separate opinion. It's got a completely separate set of processes. And like we talked about above or upstream in this call, you will be tested on the controls over compliance for those grants, but you will also be tested over the compliance for those grants. So talking about payroll as our example we kind of used before, who's reviewing the payroll? How are they reviewing it? How are they making sure that that person's time was allocated to the grant properly? And then ultimately, was that person's time allocated to the grant properly? And if you can vouch and support all of that, your audit would go just fine. But as your entity grows, as you get more federal money, different grants start to be tested every year. You might find that in your first 1 or 2 years of having a single audit, if you trigger one because of this CARES Act money or ESSER money, that your auditors are looking at everything. And that's because basically they have to. So keep that in mind, but doesn't change the way you have to do work. If you're a governmental entity, you still have to do internal controls, right? You still receive a gas report, but just creates a new way of thinking in terms of the controls over the grant and making sure that you're documenting everything, not just for the people reviewing and approving the funds, but for the auditors that have to submit this data to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse at the end of your audit. And I see a few questions coming in too, but I hope that covers your thought there, Lester, on the single audit and triggering that.
Sure.
So.
And one of the questions is what do we expect during a single audit? And a lot of the things we talked about today are going to come up during your single audit. We're going to talk to the grant admin. We're going to review internal controls and see if you have elements and layers to over compliance and internal control over compliance. We're going to check reporting. There are compliance requirements, elements that we would look at, and we're probably all familiar with them: allowable costs, allowable expenses, period of availability. There's some eligibility, that's one as well. So there are various elements that we would look at. And ideally, most of the things we talked about today, developing policies and procedures, developing internal controls, reporting, the information, those all combine to be things that we would look at during a single audit for your organization. So it looks like what else? Federal loan.
I see one other question here about a federal loan. Lester, do you have clients with federal loans and how they treat that on their single audit? I know I have a couple as well, but I know you've got some.
And you do treat that towards the 750, but it's carved out a little bit differently as far as computing. There's some elements that go into major programs. There's some calculations that we do on our side. But certainly if you get a federal loan program as part of this federal money, and eventually it gets rolled up into a single audit at some point for organizations. So yes, that would come into play eventually. But the
most common ones are HUD loans, right? That seems to be the most common going around this area over the past decade or so.
Yeah, or things through the USDA as well. And certainly all of the things we talked about today, those are all applicable to those programs as well, having those administrators and controls in place to gather all that information. So, well, we're almost out of time here, and I think we've answered all the questions. I see someone mentioned the compliance supplement in section 6. Certainly, those names are in the back there, and we mentioned to everyone we can, download a copy of that. It's Anthony mentioned it's like 1,700 pages long, and it seems to get longer every year. And I think we're on addendum 2 for 2021, and they haven't contemplated the 2022 compliance supplement yet, but something to keep handy at your organization to store that with the rest of your documentation. But hopefully we've given you a start, to think about federal money, federal programs. We've seen a lot of folks deal with this problem for the first time ever. And certainly it's going to continue with all the ARPA money that's being passed around by the state and other elements of the CARES Act funding that's going around now. And hopefully we've given you some ideas to think about. I know there are some organizations that have robust grant departments, but there might be something we mentioned that you might consider to put in place, and just something just as simple as making sure you have those policies and procedures written down. Those are always valuable things to have handy. We thank you for joining us today, and hopefully everyone has all their federal money sorted out and is ready. And if they have a single audit, and otherwise, give us a chat. We'd love to talk more about this and answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Definitely reach out. Look forward to hearing from people. So
I do think we need to award our gift card. I apologize
Yes.
for that. Let's see.
I have the list over here too. You may to pull a number.
Pull it,
Pull my
Anthony. We'll get that sent over.
Accountants, we like to use randomizers. So hold on, let me get this over here. All right, number 4, if I'm looking at the list, that's, I see BJ Francis. So.
All right, congratulations. All right, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye now.